I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to this seminar to Behold the Throne, an introduction to Merkavah Mysticism. This lecture series is possible because of the generous support of the patrons of this channel. In fact, this entire channel is an experiment in crowd-funded university-level education made accessible completely for free. Open access, no paywalls. Access to reliable scholarly education on any topic shouldn't plunge anybody into thousands of dollars of debt, and I'm committed to making topics that I have expertise in and the history of Western esotericism as accessible to the public as possible. That said, if you benefit from the channel or from this course, I'd ask you to please consider supporting the channel for the production of free courses like this via a yearly contribution to my Patreon for as little as like $54 a year. It's basically a cup of coffee a month. But I genuinely appreciate your consideration for supporting this channel and making this kind of educational content possible. But to be clear, I am grateful for the work that I'm able to do, and I'm very happy to welcome you to this open access seminar, To Behold the Throne, an introduction to Merkavah Mysticism. All right, folks. Well, welcome back to what is the last. Although again, it's mostly like I think they said of works of art. Works of art aren't completed; they're just abandoned. So this is the last in the sense that I'm just abandoning the task rather than following through with it, because there's so much more that we could be doing. But this is the last installment, at least, of the official Esoterica seminar, which I was about to say summer seminar, which I think in the description it still does say summer seminar, but that is laughable at this point. So we are now very much in the wrapping up, and what I'm calling the Twilight. We began this to ascend in peace, as Rabbi Akiva did, and that's Hashem. We will descend in peace as well, and this is what I call the Twilight of the Merkavah, because in many ways, Merkavah mysticism doesn't get abandoned; it becomes subsumed. It manages to survive, although in sort of the larger umbrella of the world of the Kabbalah. And so, as we'll see, as we transition to how the Merkavah will be transformed by the Kabbalist, we should, I think, appreciate just how epic of a journey this literature has been on, both in terms of its metaphysical axis. We've really explored, I think, at great length the real metaphysical richness, puzzling and sometimes terrifying richness of this tradition. But that metaphysical axis we spent a good bit of time on, but also think of sort of the terrestrial axis, the axis of space and time. We're talking about a literature from a minority religion, very small religion, all things told, and this is a subset of that small religion. Again, Judaism is a very tiny religion, less than 1% of the world's population, maybe a little more back then. But of that group, this is a tiny subsection of people. And this literature that they produced, they remain mysterious to us now, but that tiny group of people produced a literature that, for reasons that we don't fully understand and will probably never understand, other Jews felt the need to copy it, to preserve it, to continue to practice it. In a literature that may have been produced originally in the 4th century or 5th century, 3rd century, who knows, in Palestine, it would go on to be edited and flourish in Babylon. It would travel back to Egypt, where we find numerous examples of it in manuscripts in the Karaganiza. It probably traveled over North Africa into Spain. As I said last time, we see some of it being translated into Ganel's Summa Sacra Magici. So we think that maybe it traveled over North Africa and over eventually into Spain. It likely traveled into Italy, and then it would cross the Alps, and there it would be taken up and finally edited into the version most of us now appreciate by the Chassidei Ashkenaz, which we'll talk about in just a moment. So just think about that journey. I mean, imagine, for those of you who've made a journey like that, imagine taking the journey from Regensburg in Germany all the way over to what is now Fallujah in Iraq. And then think about that over time, over hundreds of years. We're talking about somehow 800 years where this literature continued to be developed and edited and traveled. And I think that's just a fascinating journey. And just that alone tells us that people were interested in this material. And while it is strange and unusual to us, and perhaps extremely obscure to us now, that wasn't the case for much of Jewish history. And in many ways, we can think about the existence of the Kabbalah, which has now been around in Judaism for about 800 years, if you think about the mirror image of that, the Merkavah mysticism, the Merkavah literature, existed in the 800 years prior to the rise of Kabbalah, assuming a date of somehow around the 500 of the Common Era as an editorial horizon. So if you think about the fact that Kabbalah has been around with us for 800 years, in many ways, Merkavah mysticism was also around with Judaism for about 800 years, spreading from Fallujah, what is now Fallujah in Iraq, all the way to Spain, and as far north at least as into Germany. And I want to put forward that while this literature is obscure to us now, I think we shouldn't let that obscurity diminish the impact and the interest of this literature. Because think about how easy it is for a group of literature to be lost. It takes one generation of people not to copy it, and one generation of people not to be interested, and it's gone. Literature lives at the knife's edge of forgetting, and for whatever reason, Jewish populations as diverse as Germans and North Africans and Italians and Arab Jews and Palestinian Jews all felt the need to preserve this literature, and I think that says something. For 800 years, they preserved it, they edited it, they copied it, and I would suggest they practice it as well. So at the same time as this is all going on, other forms of Jewish mysticism are also arising in the Jewish world. This was a very fecund period for the development of Jewish mysticism. And just to mention that one of those that arrives around the same time as the Merkavah mysticism in its sort of final redacted form, at least, is the Sefer Yetzirah. And the Sefer Yetzirah, of course, if we take Tzahi Weiss's dating to sometime in the 7th century, of the Common Era, that is, we find in that literature a form of Maaseh Bereshit. And again, we've mentioned that there are these two forms of mysticism that the rabbis seem to know in the Gemara, in the Mishnah. They seem to know some type of Merkavah mysticism, and they also know some type of cosmological, esoteric speculation that they refer to as Maaseh Bereshit. And this is the doing of creation. And again, listen to that language. The language there is active. It's Maaseh Bereshit. It's the doing of creation. It's not just speculation in the sense of, I wonder where all this came from. It's the sense of, I think you can do your own type of creating. And in that way, we should understand Maaseh Bereshit not as esoteric cosmological speculation alone, but a kind of theurgy. And in fact, when you look at the commentary tradition that arose on the Maaseh Bereshit in just a moment, it in fact is directly tied to a type of Jewish theurgy. But of course, this very brief and enigmatic text describes how the universe, the Olam, was created through the use of Hebrew letters, and it mixes very playfully linguistics, phonology, literally describing in the divine mouth how these letters were articulated, and also, of course, metaphysics. And it's in this literature that we learn how the world was said to have come into being, and it comes into being through something that the text refer to as the Sfirot. And the Sfirot are mysterious at this point. This is a strange word, by the way, the word Sfirot. It's from the root word, which means something like to count. And already there was a word for numbers, mispar, right? Misparim. There's already a word for numbers in Hebrew. But they decided for whatever reason to put a feminine plural ending on it and made it into Sfirot. And this word is strange because it means something like numerations. But it's important to note that in the Sefer Yetzirah, the Sfirot are not yet emanations of the divine. That is a later development we'll come back to in a minute, but this is a Neo-Pythagorean text, a text that understands numbers and letters as somehow co-terminal with creation, that letters and directions and elements and moral valences are all built into some fundamental tenness. And if you know something about Pythagoreanism, the idea of the decad is incredibly important in that development. And so the monad becomes the dyad becomes, and if you add 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you get 10, this is the kind of thing that Neo-Pythagoreans really loved. And it was also a version of this found in the Sefer Yetzirah. And we get these letter, metaphysical, natural correspondences in the Sefer Yetzirah. And this text would be subject in the same way that the Merkavah mysticism was the subject of intense speculation and interest by Jews following the production of the material. The Sefer Yetzirah, as short as it is, in shortest form, it's only 2,500 words. It's extremely short. But in the Sefer Yetzirah, we get extensive commentaries by people like the Sadia Gaon and other people, where we get these scientific analysis of how the world came into being, but also magical commentaries, which will matter more in just a minute. And of course, it's in those magical commentaries, primarily in times like the 13th century, where Eliezer of Worms will develop the idea that one can create a golem, an artificial humanoid, from the use of the Sefer Yetzirah. And so this idea develops enormously into the Jewish world. But again, this is a parallel form of mysticism where Maaseh Bereshit and Maaseh Merkavah are following two different tracks. And we could have an entire seminar just on the development of Maaseh Bereshit as a form of practical Jewish theurgy, along with its speculative component as well. So there's a theory and a practice element to this form of mysticism. But as I mentioned, the Hekhalot literature is going to make its way into Central Europe. And it's going to make its way via a group of people called the Kalonymus family. And the Kalonymus family was an Italian family. You can probably even hear that their name sounds slightly Greek. They were probably original Ramonian Jews, perhaps. But they will ultimately move away from Italy, and they will settle in Regensburg. Regensburg is an important site for all of my Hildegard of Bingen fans, because that is where Hildegard of Bingen also moved her nunnery. So this is sort of a place to be in the High Middle Ages if you're interested in mysticism, whether Jewish or Christian. But this extremely important family, the Kalonymus family, is going to produce some of the most beautiful poetry from the Middle Ages. And in fact, if you've ever read any of the Piyutim, especially Piyutim liturgical poems, specifically during the high holidays, many of those extremely intense and terrifying Rosh Hashanah Piyutim are actually downstream of the Kalonymus family. So they are poetic geniuses. It's a family of poetic geniuses, but also of ritual practitioners and theologians. But what ends up happening in the Kalonymus family is they ultimately develop a very peculiar theology, perhaps arguably the most peculiar theology ever developed in Judaism. And it was marked by an obsession, frankly, with evil. And this is not a difficult thing to imagine why they're so obsessed with evil. They're being massacred by the Crusaders and stuff like this. But some of them are having their kids murdered in front of them. It's quite gruesome, horrifying stuff. But at any rate, they're obsessed with evil. And part of what they are obsessed with evil about is they take it that evil is actually proof for the existence of God, that the forces of evil actually exist to punish the unrighteous. And the very act of that punishment shows that there is, in fact, God, that demons are in sort of inverse and proof of God. And they're all interested in magic. They're interested in divine judgment. And they seek to follow not only the Torah, but they come to believe that God's justice is so severe that you have to follow what might be referred to as an esoteric Torah, that simply following the rules in the Torah are not enough to actually achieve salvation, that you have to follow even stricter rules. And these even stricter rules are often referred to as a ratzon borei, the will of the Creator, that the Creator has developed unwritten rules, and that through various esoteric practices, you can learn these unwritten rules, and then you can begin to follow this sort of extremely esoteric Torah. And this would include all kinds of radical moral, ritual, and penitential practices that they refer to as the din shemayim, the judgment of heaven. And many of these took the form of things like extreme acts of mortification of the flesh, extreme acts of fasting, rolling around in snow naked, rolling around in nettles naked, doing all kinds of things to mortify the flesh, probably in some level imitating the kind of extreme mortification of the flesh that you see were going on in Christian practices at this time. But because of their extreme piety, they become known as the Chassidei Ashkenaz, the pietists of Germany, or the German pietists. Now, they are not connected, or only tenuously connected, to the later movement, the 18th century movement that we now know as Hasidism, Chassidut, but they became infamous, really, for this extreme piety. But they also developed fascinating interest in magic, and this is where, out of the context of commentaries on texts like the Sefer Yetzirah, that they would ultimately develop things like golem making and other kinds of extreme speculative, frankly strange versions of Judaism. But it would be among the Chassidei Ashkenaz that would the Merkavah literature, which they were very interested in for reasons that I'll come back to in just a moment, I think, but they were extremely interested in the Hekhalot literature, and they were the people that ultimately would edit it into the form that we now have it, at least as much as we have it in the Sefer Synopsis. I think the reason why they're so fascinated with the Hekhalot literature is precisely because of how horrifying it is. Again, the Chassidei Ashkenaz literally argue that the world that we live in is filled with just enough suffering that a tiny group of righteous people, maybe just a handful every generation, can actually survive the world. That they will merit the world to come. Only a handful of people every generation will merit the world to come. And that the justice of God was so severe that God created other creations before our world, and God's justice was so severe that those other creations were instantly destroyed by the justice of God. And ours is minimally just, right? Filled with all the suffering you could imagine for 13th century Jews. They're like, this is just right. This is a great world. This is the best world possible because only a tiny group of people will survive it and be righteous. I think the reason why they liked the Hekhalot literature is because in that literature, the angels and God are described in the fiercest possible terms. And so you get a sense that you are at the imminent, you're facing your imminent doom, and this imminent doom is what they liked. And therefore, only a tiny group of righteous people could make the ascent and actually go and be with God in the afterlife. So I think that it's the rigor of the Hekhalot literature that I think is part of the reason why the Chassidei Ashkenaz took a particular interest in preserving this literature. But at the same time that the Chassidei Ashkenaz are also developing their peculiar, strange theology of Judaism, all kinds of other forms of Jewish mysticism are emerging at this time. We have the unique cherub circle. This is a group of people that are very interested in the idea that there is a very particular entity called the unique cherub, the Kiruv Minukad, and this unique cherub is the visible version of God, and this is the entity that actually takes prayers. When you pray, this is what you're praying to. You're praying to this unique cherub, and this unique cherub is the outward manifestation of an otherwise hidden God. Again, more solutions to the sort of the problem, the revelation problem, the revelation paradox. So we see the unique cherub circle in Germany. We see the Chassidei Ashkenaz in Ashkenaz in Germany. We see the Iyun circle developing in France, although there's now a debate. Sholem argued that they developed in France, although Verman, who is the more recent editor of the text of the Iyun circle, argue that they actually are also developing in Germany. So that's where the scholarship is, I think, on that topic. But the Iyun circle is also interested in these emanations of God, and they think that these emanations of God are actually how the world comes into being. So we have one of the first early contacts of Jewish Neoplatonism in sort of Neoplatonism inside of Judaism with the unique cherub circle. So this is a place where, again, we're beginning to see something, or rather with the Iyun circle, where they begin to name these as Sifrot. What's interesting, however, about the Iyun circle is the Iyun circle still uses the traditional 13 attributes of God to be the Sfirot, and therefore there are 13 Sfirot originally, rather than 10. Right, so originally there are 13, which makes sense considering that God is thought to have 13 attributes of mercy, and therefore that makes sense to make them the 13 Sfirot. But in the Iyun circle, it's 13 rather than 10. However, by the text like the Sefer Bahir, the Sefer Bahir is going to be the first true text of Kabbalah. They're going to emerge maybe in Provence, we don't know. But this text is referred to as the Midrash of Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakana. That should all set off everyone's Hekhalot alarms, because he's one of our Hekhalot heroes. We've been with him since the very beginning of the course. And unsurprisingly, the very first text of the Kabbalah is going to be the bridge that connects Hekhalot literature with the emergent world of the Sfirot. And it will be the Sefer Bahir that will make it such that the Sfirot are 10. And they're going to land on the number 10 because of the Sefer Yetzirah, which says famously 10, not 11, 10, not 9. And that is a number they're going to land on in the Sefer Bahir. They're going to use a verse in Chronicles to anchor that into the text. And here we have connective tissue
between the Merkavah literature and the proto-Kabbalistic literature in the form of the Sefer Bahir, which is an extraordinarily difficult text because it's an editorial nightmare. I think the joke that Gershom Scholem said is that whoever wrote the Sefer Bahir, they wrote it down on loose paper and then threw it into the air, and as it fell back down to earth, they edited it together the way that it fell. It is an extraordinarily weird text. There's some Gnostic elements in there as well. There's probably some Crypto-Sophia stuff in there, which is fascinating. But if you're interested in these early proto forms of Kabbalah, I've done episodes on all of them on the channel. So if you want reading lists or to get a little bit more into them, feel free to get into them. But for our purposes today, it's going to be in the area around Castile, where we are going to see the circle around Moshe de Leon, people like Joseph Gicatila, and other kinds of people in Spain and areas like Guadalajara and Zaragoza. It's going to be in the region of Castile that a circle of people centered on the person of Rabbi Moshe de Leon are going to produce the literature that becomes the Zohar. And the Zohar, of course, produced in the second half of the 13th century. Although I want to, again, I want to sort of thread the needle and say that on the one hand, yes, it is a novel production of the 13th century, and yet, and also in many other ways, they're dealing with very traditional Jewish texts. It is not a text born out of whole cloth, and it is very much speaking the language of Talmud. It's very much speaking the language of Bible, although in its own peculiar Aramaic, but it is also speaking the language of the Hekhalot literature. And it would be this circle that would ultimately be around the production of the Zohar around Moshe de Leon, which folks like Yehuda Liebes has very clearly shown that it wasn't just one person, that it was definitely an editorial crew that ultimately developed the Zohar as we know it. But it'd be around that crew of people that would ultimately produce what we now know as the Kabbalah. And so it's in this context that something very strange happens. In the earliest stratas of the compositions of the Zohar, we begin to see that the Kabbalists, the early Kabbalists, are kind of, in some sense, building a bridge to the Kabbalah. And they build the bridge to the Kabbalah with two ingredients. One of those ingredients is a text called the Midrash HaNa'ilam, the hidden Midrash. And the Midrash HaNa'ilam is the earliest strata of what became the Zohar. And that text looks very much like the Sefer Bahir, and it looks like traditional Midrash literature. And in fact, if you read it, the Sfirot are hardly there. They're still developing the idea of the Sfirot. It's not fully formed yet. In fact, I would argue that it's never fully formed. But in the Midrash and the Elam, they're still developing what they're doing. They're still like figuring out what they're doing. But also another ingredient that's going to make the Kabbalah that is in one of these earliest sections of the Zohar is going to be the Zohar Chadash. Now, we call the Zohar Chadash the new Zohar because it was printed after the printing of the original version of the Zohar. But don't be fooled. Much of the material in the Zohar Chadash is actually from the earliest strata of the production of the Zohar literature. And inside of the Zohar Chadash is a text referred to as the Merkavah Yezikel, right? It is the Merkavah of Ezekiel. And it is a mystical commentary on the Merkavah, incorporating this earliest strata of Kabbalah. So if you want to see the bridge between Merkavah literature and Kabbalah, that's the text. And it's to be found at Zohar Chadash 37c to 47a. And if you want to get a sense of about how long it is, at least in the modern Pritzker edition, so this is it in volume 12 of the Pritzker. So it's not terribly long, right? It's about, let's see how many pages in English it is. It's about 60 pages in English with notes. But here is ground zero for the idea that the Merkavah literature and Kabbalah are now talking to each other. And this is a place where I think if you want to get into the bridge between them, that's where you're going to go. But of course, the Kabbalists weren't done with Merkavah literature, because not only were they going to speculate about the nature of the chariot, but also they were going to revisit Merkavah literature itself. So far as we can tell, the writer of the Zohar had a copy of at least Merkavah Rabbah, right? Or Rabbati, right? They had a copy of Hekhalot Rabbati, rather, and they take the text and they do something very, very interesting. They rewrite it. They make their own Merkavah literature. And inside of the Zohar al-Torah, we have a completely new set of Merkavah literature. And when I say it's extensive, you'll believe me, because this is it in the Pritzker edition. It's also in volume 12. So if you want to get all your Hekhalot or your Zohar Hekhalot material, that's it. It is hundreds of pages, right, of text. And it runs from 340, runs from 4 to 342. So you're talking about 300 pages in English of completely new Hekhalot material in the Zohar. So we have a brand new Hekhalot literature in the Zohar. Now, what's fascinating about the Hekhalot literature in the Zohar is what they do with it. So there's two things here, actually. First thing, the first of these texts is called Hekhalot Bereshit, because it's found in the Zohar's commentary on Parsha Bereshit. The other is called Hekhalot Pikudei, which is because it's found in the, it's many editions, it's found in the Zohar on Pikudei. But what's important to note is that all the scholars who've worked on this material agree that it was originally independent compositions. They were not stuck in there originally. They were independent Merkavah compositions, but they're Merkavah compositions now interacting with the fully developed ideas of the Kabbalah. Further, they're the same text. Hekhalot Bereshit was written first, and it contains all of the major elements of the Zoharic Hekhalot. And then, in a stroke of luck, the writer of that text decided to go back to the text and rewrite it with more material. So Hekhalot Pikudei is the rewritten, expanded form of Hekhalot Bereshit, and it's 3 times longer. 3 times longer. It is enormous, 150 pages, something like that, 200 pages in the Pritzker. So this is a place where we have a completely new idea about what Merkavah literature is. And so what we get in Maaseh and Hekhalot Bereshit, in the Zohar, is we get an image of Adam before Adam has fallen. This is the androgyne Adam Kadmon. And now you're probably hearing, right? Now we're hearing all this Kabbalistic language. Now, just for the folks who know some Kabbalah, notice how little Kabbalistic language we've heard up until this lecture. This has been an entire course stretching 17 lectures. I don't know how many hours, probably 20 hours of lectures. No Kabbalah. Now it's beginning to get into Kabbalah land because now we're into the Zohar. But what we find is the pre-lapsarian Adam, the Adam Kadmon, the androgyne Adam. And in paradise, in the Garden of Eden, this pre-lapsarian Adam is being lectured to by the angels. He's being informed, or I should say they are being informed. This is an androgyne being. They're being informed about the structure of reality. That is to say, how is reality structured from where they're sitting in Gan Eden all the way up to the very roof of heaven, so to speak, up the Sefirot, and then also in the inverted structures below them. And what we learn is that the Hekhalot that we know of are now located in just above and below the Garden of Eden. So there is a set of Hekhalot, 7 Hekhalot going up from the Garden of Eden, and 7 Hekhalot going down from the Garden of Eden. Now, whether these are going down into the ground isn't clear. I don't think they are. They're definitely heavenly somehow. But these are now 2 sets of 7 Hekhalot. And what we learn is that in order to, let's talk about the first one, the what we might call the inferior Hekhalot. These 7 Hekhalot are the realm of the dead. And in order to go into the realm of the dead, you have to gain a special garment, a special soul garment. And this soul garment allows you to descend into the 7 Hekhalot beneath the Garden of Eden. And as you go down the Hekhalot, they become more and more and more righteous. So for people who are at the starting Hekhalot, they're minimally righteous. And then by the 7th, they are the most righteous people. And so you go down through these layers of the Hekhalot, and in the 7th is where the angel Michael dwells. So Michael, we are told, now lives in the 7th Hechal beneath the Garden of Eden. So it's not God's throne room anymore. It's the 7th room where the angel Michael lives. And there we learn that the extremely righteous now delight in the supernal light flowing from the world to come. So 2 sets of Hechalot. The inferior one is where the righteous dead go. And at the top of that one, or the center of that one, I'm not sure which way we're moving anymore, but at the highest point of that Hechal is the archangel Michael, and all of the righteous dead, the most righteous dead, are basking in the light that is flowing from the world to come. But what about the other Hechalot, the superior Hechalot? Those Hechalot are located just above the Garden of Eden, but they are now below the system of the Sefirot. So if you know your system, if you know your Sefirot, right, you can go back to this image here with Malchut at the bottom. See how there's a little hole coming out of Malchut at the bottom? The way to get into that hole is through the Hechalot now. The 7th Hechalot are no longer imagined by the Zohar to be the structure of the universe, whereby at the center is the throne of God. They are now the entrance into the world of the Sefirot, right? And this makes some sense, because what are the Sefirot? The Sefirot are the body of God. So in some sense, this makes sense that you need to transverse the 6 Hechalot to get into the Sefirot, because the Sefirot are in fact the body of God. So now we've just gotten a bigger and more Baroque structure, right? A bigger and more Baroque structure. Surprise, surprise. It's Kabbalah with a bunch of nested structures that get more and more complicated. But what we have in the 6 Sefirot, folks may recognize this arrangement. This is one of the arrays of the Sefirot from Cordovero, who everyone knows I have my favorite Kabbalist is Cordovero. This is the letter array. This is my favorite array of the Sefirot. And I like this one because it has that Hechalot feel to it, right? So you're at Malchut at the middle, and there's Keter around it at the very end. But at any rate, this is a great representation that feels Hechaloti to me, right? It has a Hechalot vibe in this way of arranging the Sefirot. So if you want to imagine where the Hechalot are in this image, they are in the very middle of that mem. This is the God's eye view looking down the Sefirot. At the very center of that mem is where the 7 Hechalot are of the Zohar. So a completely new location for where these are. And things are all different. Rather than the Hechalot being filled with terrifying angels that are wanting to kill you at any moment, we now have angels that are simply dazzling. Every word for light and lamp and glitter and shine and bright is to be found in the Zohar's version of the Hechalot. These areas are now just like disco balls of brilliance. These are just increasing levels of light. And so as you descend or ascend, again, the directionality here is so perplexing, but no longer do we have the fearsome, horrifying angels with their bows and their horses covered with blood. We now have just structures of pure light increasing in their brilliance, in their radiation, in their glory. I mean, again, they use every word that you can imagine for describing these entities. And they are nested one within another, a bit like the Hechalot of the literature we've already seen. And they're marked by a central pillar. And that central pillar, once they are aligned, we'll talk about aligning them in just a minute, that central pillar allows you to transverse one Hechal to the next. One climbs through that pillar. But the question is, how do you realign them? And this is where the Hechalot literature and the Zohar's version of the Hechalot are fundamentally different. No longer are we memorizing a bunch of angel names. No longer are we have a bunch of Nomina Barbara. No longer are we doing any of that. It's prayer. If you direct your prayer with intense piety toward the Hechalot, it literally moves the Hechalot such that it realigns them. It realigns them, and as your prayer reaches up through the Hechalot, they become realigned. It's a bit like tumblers in a lock, right? When you put the key in, all the tumblers have to fall just right. Your prayer actually acts as a theurgical mechanism in the Kabbalah by which all of the systems of the 7 Hekhalot are realigned. And what happens when they're realigned is absolutely breathtaking. The realignment of the lower 6 allows for the emergence of the 7th Hechal. The alignment of the lower 6 produces the 7th Hechal, and that 7th Hechal is Malchut. The 7th Hechal is the Shekhinah. It's Malchut. It's the presence of God. That prayer unlocks our access to Malchut, to the Shekhinah, and by realigning them, we're basically creating what the text refers to sometimes as the womb of being. And once they're aligned, the womb of being, the 7th Hechal, becomes the Sfirat of Malchut. And once the womb of being is formed and opened the way the text uses it, then the flow coming down the Sfirot, remember there's always flow coming down the Sfirot. Once that flow comes down from Binah, it reaches down from Binah, it attaches itself to Yesod, the divine phallus, and what happens? Hyros Gamos. Hyros Gamos happens. The system of the Sfirot, it says that the 7th is joined to the 7th. The 7th Sfirot, Yesod, the divine phallus, the foundation, is then joined to the 7th Hechal. And what is the 7th Hechal? Malchut. What the Kabbalists have done is breathtaking. They have united their system of the flow, the Shefa of the Spherotic system with the palace system, the theurgical palace system, and they've combined them such that it's basically a pyramid going up, so that one engenders, one arouses the Sfirot of Malchut, and by arousing Malchut, it allows for the womb of being to be opened, such that Yesod can enter into Malchut. It's Hyros Gamos. This is divine eroticism. Now think about what Hekhalot mysticism is. Hekhalot mysticism is foreplay. It is arousal. It is what Israel does to arouse the divine, such that the divine, the androgyne divine, can engage in its own autoerotic, orgasmic pleasure. The system is now one of arousal. You're no longer trying to sneak into the divine throne rooms with a bunch of passcodes and all this. What you're now trying to do is realign the divine through erotic arousal, such that the divine can basically engage in its own erotic union. So you manage to join the 7th with the 7th. So it is a breathtaking riff, change, alteration, innovation, renovation of what Hekhalot mysticism is. We transform from a mysticism of basically trying to sneak a peek at God's throne to see the king in his beauty, which has its own erotic connotations, but now it's transformed into a form of Kabbalistic foreplay, such that arousing the divine will allow the divine flow to flow properly through the system. And you'll remember that's the point of Kabbalah. The point of the Zohar, the only point of all of this, is to allow the flow of the divine through the divine, such that it will flow down to us and we can flow back up into the divine. Classic procession, recession that we see in something like Plotinus, but of course here very much wrapped up in this Kabbalistic framework. Thus, what we have in the Kabbalistic version of the Hechal, of the Hechalot, is, like I said, it is now part of the sexual dynamics of the Kabbalistic system more generally. And what's fascinating is the Kabbalists did not look at the Hechalot literature and say, well, we're going to shelve that. We got a new thing. We have the Sfirot. We have this whole new system of Tikkun. We have all this other stuff. Notice what the Kabbalists didn't do. They didn't shelve it. They incorporated it. They built it into the system. And I know all of you have seen these images, right, of the Sfirot. Every one of you have seen, I imagine, these images of the Sefirot. But guess what every single one of them leaves out? The 6 Hekhalot before Malchut. So now every time I want you to see one of these Tree of Life sequences, I want you to also know that in the Zohar itself, in the Zohar, it describes the system just below Malchut. Malchut has to be produced by us. We produce it through our prayer. Our prayer allows Malchut to open, to emerge, and it's only through that prayer, through that theurgy, through that erotic theurgy, that Malchut emerges as the 7th Hechal. So every time you see one of these images of the Tree of Life, you should always see six Hechalot leading up to Malchut. Malchut is not a thing that exists. Malchut is a thing that is brought into being. It is a womb that is conjured into being through the erotic prayer of the faithful. And it does it by realigning the world of the 6 lower Hechalot described in very complex detail in Hechalot Bereshit, but also in Hechalot Pikudei. So here again, a genius, just shows you the absolute breathtaking genius of the Zohar. It is able to take a system like the Hechalot and then renovate it such that it now fits into the larger landscape of the mythscape of the Kabbalah. So what we have, right, are this literature. We have a new version. And of course, we're not going to have time to work on it because this is the last lecture. But what I want to do, as I like to do in any sort of lecture like this, is let you know that at the end of the Hekhalot literature of antiquity is a brand new Hekhalot literature. And a brand new Hekhalot literature spanning hundreds of pages, 300 pages of the Zohar. And I just want you to know, when I say 300 pages of the Zohar, you should you should quake in your boots, because the Zohar, even single pages of Zohar, are extremely complex. Just to give you some sense of this, right? If you take a look at a page from Hekhalot Pikudei, just a random page, you can see Daniel Matt's translation on the top half. The bottom half are all notes. That's how complex this literature is. It is dense, it is rich, it is beautiful, but it is tough. But here, I want to end on the note that we have with the Hekhalot interpretation to be found in the Zohar. The Zohar has all this extremely complex, extremely Baroque. We have Hekhalot inside of Hekhalot. We have palaces inside of palaces. We have palaces, the upper and lower versions of palaces built in. But at Hekhalot Pikudei, they tell us, Shimon Bar Yochai says to us, all these arrangements follow a single principle. Beneath all of the complexity of this, there's a single uniting principle. And we learn from Shimon Bar Yochai, it exists so that the low can be comprised on high. And it is at that idea that all of this is in the service, that the low can be comprised on high, that the human being can be angelified, that the human being can be elevated, that the human being can become superhumanly righteous, gaze at the divine throne and be transformed, can enter into the divine eroticism of the Zohar with prayer. That prayer allows one to engage in the act of Hyros Gamos within the very structure of the divine. And the point of all of it is so that the low can be comprised on high. And it is here that I want to say farewell to the descenders and to encourage you to go through a new adventure with a new generation of descenders, the generation of the descenders of the Zohar and the Kabbalistic Hekhalot literature that's always there, that you see, and every time you see that image of the Tree of Life, just know that beneath it are 6 Hekhalot, and it is your prayers that open the way to Malchut and to the divine body. Thank you.